Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview experts from around the world on presentation skills, leadership, visibility, and communication challenges. My guest today is Cindy Solomon, one of my favorite leadership experts. But before I get into the conversation with her, I'd like to tell you that if you are interested in knowing how your presentation skills are stacking up, please take my 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can find out where you are strong with your presentation skills and where perhaps a little support could help you get better results. Today, I am delighted to be able to interview the wonderful Cindy Solomon. She's somebody I've been following for years and always loved meeting her when I listen to her. And she really gives me information. In our conversation, we talked about all sorts of ways of courageous leadership, as well as concrete suggestions for how you can raise your visibility. This is why I wanted to do this. And I have to say that when I'm in Austria and I am 9 hours ahead of the West Coast, if Cindy is doing a speech, I will get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to listen. She's the only one I do that for. So I have to say this is very much worth listening to. Here's the official bio. Cindy Solomon is a leadership expert and best-selling author and a world-class speaker. She helps Fortune 500 companies build courageous leadership or at scale, which is better enabling their teams and organizations to compete and win during any disruption. With her courageous leadership keynotes and virtual and live leadership programs, Cindy has helped hundreds of companies around the world identify, nurture, and leverage their leadership potential in both their frontline employees and their leadership teams. She counts among her clients the 26 J.D. Power Award winners, as well as industry leaders such as Google, Alaska Airlines, UPS, Oracle, Wells Fargo, the Ritz-Carlton, and the list goes on and on and on. We spoke before the conversation also to talk about, this is part of the Pride Month series for Speakers Who Get Results. And she has said that being out as a gay woman has made her so much more authentic and herself. And she's really been able to embrace courageous leadership on her own terms because she's been true to who she is. And that's very important for all of us to remember. So without further ado, here's to the conversation with Cindy Solomon. Cindy Solomon, I'm so happy I finally got you on Speakers Who Get Results. Welcome.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, good. This is great. As I said in the intro, I've been watching you and following you for a long time, and I love running across you whenever I can. Before we get started on courageous leadership, tell me, if you had a dream interview, you could talk to somebody who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be in the audience?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so that's a really tough one because I have a list as long as my arm. I think I'm going to give you two because I think they're interesting in different ways. The first one is Eleanor Roosevelt. She is probably my greatest idol and guiding light in the world. She became powerful and successful in a time when it was nearly impossible for women to do that. You know, she didn't have any of the outward attributes that were valued back in that time,
Yeah.
and yet was courageous enough to step out of a predefined role and become really, honestly, the president of the United States, and become the voice of her husband, who couldn't do a lot of the work that she was doing on behalf of the country.
Because he was in a wheelchair.
Because he was in a wheelchair. She had to be his legs and his eyes and his ears, and became a force of her own even after that role ended. You know, went to the UN, created the Human Rights Commission. She just never stopped changing the world for the better. And I believe it was through her courageous acts that we have a better world right now than we had before she was on it.
Okay, cool. And then who's the other one?
The other one is Amelia Earhart. And partially it's because I want to know where the heck she is. I think we kind of know where she ended up, but I'm not so sure. But Amelia Earhart was another one who stepped out of the traditional role of a woman and simply refused to take no for an answer. Mm-hmm. Found her own path, her own way, and didn't let any of the no's get in her way of her doing what she wanted to do, which was to be in the sky.
Yeah. You know, both of them just went ahead and did what they wanted to do. I often think that Eleanor Roosevelt never really planned to become what she became. She just did the next thing that was in front of her, and somebody had to do this, so she's going to step in and do it. Somebody had to do that, let's step in and do that, until she realized, I have an identity of my own.
Yeah.
And grew into it. Yeah,
exactly. I also think that she had a deep-seated need to make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. I think she wanted to leave it better than she found it. And I think that value and that desire helped her move forward even when the odds were against her.
Yeah. Well, and she lived through 2 world wars. So there was a lot to make better.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of courageous leadership, that's a nice title, you know, leading with courage. What do you actually mean by that?
I know,
if you could cram it into the time we have.
Exactly. Well, it actually, I have to kind of tell you the origins of it a little bit to answer that question succinctly. When, you know, I'm a recovering corporate executive, right? I ran a 3,900 person sales and marketing team for a Fortune 50 company. And when I left that world, I realized that I had 1,001 examples of terrible leadership. Mm-hmm. And literally I could count my great leaders on one hand. And I started thinking about the why of that. You know, why is it that good leadership, and certainly great leadership, seems to be so difficult to find? And what is it that those handful of people do differently than the 1,001 mediocre or terrible leaders? And I started an accidental research project, and I actually talk about this a little bit in my TED Talk. I started an accidental research project, and now to date, we've interviewed over 9,000 people about what separates great leaders from good leaders or mediocre leaders. What is it that they do that allows them to develop and build the people around them in a way that's so much better than many of those around them? And what we discovered was this idea of courage. And people talked a lot in our interviews about, you know, well, they had the courage to, or I had the courage to. Very rarely would they describe it for courage for themselves, but when others were looking on, they did. Mm-hmm. And we started this research project to get at the heart of what is courageous leadership and what can you do? And we learned 3 amazing and important things during our 9,000 now to date interviews on the topic. And the first thing that we learned is that courage is entirely personal. Only you can decide what takes courage for you. And it's not something that you're born with, you know, it's something that you can choose to learn and go after. And one of the things I love talking to you about this, because you totally get this, is when you think about speakers who get results, right? There are some of us who love speaking. I am one of them. Takes me zero courage to get on stage. As a matter of fact, I will knock people down to get on the stage. I love it so much. But for other people, it would take them courage to fight through their fear and anxiety and stress of being on the stage. So I kind of look to a quote from Rollo May that really helps me understand this part of the research. And it's that courage is not the absence of fear. Rather, it's the ability to take action in spite of your fear.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, getting on stage takes no courage, but for somebody else, it will take courage to get on the stage. But courage isn't about being fearless. That's a myth. If you're not fearful, you're just not paying attention, particularly in this day and age, right? But it's the ability to take action in spite of that fear or anxiety. Second thing we learned that I think is equally important is that most of us don't think we're courageous. And this was pretty stunning to me, that only 1 in 3 of us actually believes we're courageous, when the reality is 100% of us are courageous. And the thing that was most stunning to me is that there were no demographic differentials in that belief around courage, except one, which was gender. And as a matter of fact, one of the ways I illustrate this in my keynotes is I ask let's say I'm speaking to a primarily female audience, how many of you believe you're courageous? And about a third, 20% to 30% of people will raise their hands. And they usually are like, oh, I don't know. I felt courageous earlier, but not so much now. Jane, do you feel courageous? Right? And then I ask them all to close their eyes. And in a primarily female audience with their eyes closed, almost 100% of women will raise their hands with their eyes closed. Really. And it doesn't matter where in the world I am, what the audience is. If I'm in a primarily male audience, which is, most of the very senior executive leadership events that I do are primarily male, and I ask the same question, how many of you believe you're courageous? 100% of the guys raise their hands up. I'm more courageous than him, and definitely that guy over there. But then when I ask them to close their eyes, nearly 50% of the men will bring their hands down.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Culturally, women have been taught we aren't courageous. And if we are, don't tell anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Men have been taught the equally destructive, you darn well better be courageous. And if you aren't, don't tell anybody.
Right.
And we see how this plays out at work every day, right? Women will only apply for a job if they have at least 7 of the 10 qualifications. Men will apply with less than 3 and feel perfectly comfortable applying. So it plays out in our behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing we learned, which is the magical piece of all this, is that courage can be learned. It's not something you are or aren't. It's something it's another decision-making skill or tool you can put in your toolbox if you choose to go after it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the very long answer to your question about what is this thing that you're talking about. And it's a set of behaviors and skills that you can choose to go after and build in yourself. There's a great quote by Ruth Gordon that says, courage is like a muscle, it's strengthened with use.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely true.
Well, also, I think the courage to be vulnerable. When you talk about people closing their eyes, for the men, the courage to be vulnerable and admit that maybe you're not totally certain. And for the women, the courage to say, yeah, I think I am, even though with your eyes open, you kind of expect to be slapped down if you claim courage.
Right.
It is just a cultural expectation. I actually often, the way I can live with the news these days is I think a lot about history and historical cycles and where all this came from. So I think back to where the whole gender norms started, and many of them, and does it still apply now, or is it just centuries of history that we're still carrying the baggage for? one of the things I've heard you speak many times, and you've mentioned about women getting in their own way.
Yeah.
That's a big part of the work that I do, is helping women get out of their own way. I'd like to hear what you do to help women. How do we help women learn to not sabotage themselves?
Well, and I think it's less sabotaging themselves. In my experience, it's less sabotaging themselves and more understanding the unwritten rules. And I think for me, that's why we call our Courageous Leadership for Women workshops, the unwritten rules of success. Because in my experience, and I'm sure you see this every day in the work that you do, we have a certain set of rules at the beginning of our careers that are really clear. You put the time in, you say yes to everything, you achieve the results and overachieve the results. They're very clear, black and white rules. And then somehow in the middle of our careers, the rules change and nobody really tells us that the rules are changing. They don't give us a new rule book, but all of a sudden those things are not nearly enough. They're ticket to entry. Mm-hmm. Then it becomes about your influence, your relationships, your ability to be visible, your ability to get known for specific things. Mm-hmm. And so when we when we're teaching the skills of courageous leadership for women, they are slightly different than for men. Because mm-hmm. for some reason, men understand this. They intuitively get this. I don't know how. They've got linear brains. I don't know. There's some, back room where they all get together and say, now here's the new rule book. But for women, we seem to struggle with that transition. Mm-hmm. And the first thing that we help women do is understand their strengths and how they relate directly to the business. Mm-hmm. And this is another fascinating idea. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was going,
Yeah. Yes. So this is another fascinating idea to me, because in a male audience, when I say, tell me your strengths, and men will immediately begin, grab the microphone and begin spouting their strengths that are, I'm ambitious and I'm, results driven and self-starter and blah, 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 right? You put a microphone in front of a woman in this situation, say, tell me your strengths. And they will generally, broad brushstroke, say things like, I'm a good communicator. I'm organized. I like to help people, right? It's these vague kind of namby-pamby, great. It's good you're a good communicator. I'd hope so, because you're getting a paycheck, so you should be a good communicator, right? And when I ask those same women to pretend they're a man and describe that same strength, they will use the male words. Instead of saying, I'm a good communicator, they will say, I'm especially good at taking people with disparate opinions, bringing them together and getting them focused on a common goal.
I love it.
Yeah, they will immediately transition just by putting a male, hat on, into verbiage that more specifically details what they're great at. And then more importantly, connecting it to the business. Mm-hmm. So being able to get comfortable with using that kind of language about yourself is what gets you the next role. And it's what starts to build your brand. And when I ask women, what does it feel like when you talk about yourself that way? In an audience, I did this back pre-COVID with an audience of about 6,500 women. And I said, what does it feel like you're doing when you talk about your strengths that way? You are, and the entire 6,500 women said, bragging all together in a beautiful chorus. Right?
Oh, yes, yes.
If I ask men that same question, they don't even understand the question. Uh-huh. They're befuddled by the fact that would feel like bragging. It doesn't even occur to them. They don't even understand that word. Uh-huh. So it's fascinating to me that is one of the skills that women have to be able to get past that midpoint in their career. Mm-hmm. Be able to specifically describe their strengths and be able to vocalize it confidently with specificity and how it relates to the business.
Yeah, well, my mom, I don't know if your mom did this, but my mom said, good girls don't brag. Don't, Don't
My
talk
mom
about
said, don't toot your own horn.
Yeah, same
That
thing.
was hers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Same old thing. Yep. So we are socialized that way. And also there is a perception that the risks of failure for women are so much greater than the risks of failure for men. I always think about little boys are taught to be courageous and girls are taught to be careful.
Yeah.
And so as we think about this, it actually brings me to one of my other questions for you, which is how can women within an organization, even if you're leading the organization, how can we gracefully claim the credit for what we've done without bragging? Because when women are perceived as bragging, the bar for bragging is way lower for women than it is for men. So it is a tightrope that we walk. How can we, I heard you once talk about writing an email about your plans at the beginning of the week, and then talking about your achievements, the boss email. Can you tell us about that? Because that crystallized for me something I was trying to say, but I wasn't nearly as concise as you are. So I've totally stolen that from you ever since.
Perfect. I love it. Spread it far and wide.
Yes.
I love it.
Tell us about the boss email.
Okay, well, I'll tell you about the boss email, and then I'll circle back to comment on your question earlier. So the boss email is something simple, and this is especially valuable in our live virtual hybrid world that we're going to be in for a while. I mean, if not forever, right? I mean, the 5-day work week back in an office somewhere is going to be rare, I think, at least until 2022, and maybe forever. So the boss email is something that is an accountability tool that we teach to leaders that you can actually ask your people to do for you, but you can also do it for your manager. And on a Sunday night, we all kind of start the work week on a Sunday, looking at what's ahead. It allows you to take 3 things that you want to move forward that week and share those with your boss and say, hey, Jane, I'm going to start doing a weekly update for you just because it helps myself stay accountable. And I make sure that I'm working the priorities that you want me working. This week, my main priorities to move forward are, and it's that short. It's like boop, 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 3 bullet points. Complete the XYZ project with results posted next week. Utilize time to develop Phil on my team against these 2 development priorities, and whatever else, right? And then at the, I'll let you know on Friday how I did. So it allows you to consistently be communicating with your boss, so they know what you're working on. So it alleviates some of the micromanaging that you're bound to get, particularly in a hybrid working environment. And it also ensures that you are working the right priorities that they want you working. Then at the end of the week on Friday night, before you close up shop, you send them another quick note. Hey, here's where I got to on these 3 priorities. And it holds you accountable and focuses you. It stops you from reacting to everything around you during the week and focus on the most important things, because you have to report back. But more importantly, it becomes the map of your progress during the year. And it becomes an incontrovertible piece of evidence for your annual review.
Yeah.
So that's, in my mind, particularly for women, this can be a game changer, because you now have a record with your boss of what you accomplished during the year. It also makes doing that annual review a lot easier, but it also puts in black and white your results, rather than getting the amorphous, you need to work on executive presence, blah, 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 which is just a catch-all for, I don't know what else to say to you, but you're a woman, I'm not going to promote you. This gives you incontrovertible evidence of your results throughout the year.
And if you are on C-level, in theory, your boss is then the board, right? What do you recommend? Would you recommend that for someone who is C-level or running their own company?
I would recommend doing, well, if you're running the company, I'd have everybody else doing it under you to have this be kind of a standard of the information flowing up. But if you're in the C-suite for an organization, I would argue that doing this once a month for your CEO is getting it on paper, getting that record is really important. I wouldn't do it every week. I would probably do it once a month, and I would keep it to 2 slides and say, here are my accomplishments for the month. This is what I'm working on next month. Here's how far I got. And again, it's just a written documentation of what you're working on and where you're getting results.
Yeah. I had a client who created a giant merger for her company, and she spent so much, she worked on it for 5 years. She knew it was her baby, and it was a big, giant international collaboration. And then when it was actually launched, she spent so much time saying how great the team was that the marketing department forgot it was her baby and sent all the media requests to the brand new manager who'd only been there for 2 months.
Wow.
And that was when she hired me, actually. So she said, she erased herself from the picture by being so generous. And yes, you want to credit your team, but you also need to claim credit for, it was my idea. Hello.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that goes back to your other question. And I want to comment on that. You were like, how do we do this so we're not perceived as, bragging or aggressive or whatever? And I don't think we walk that tightrope. I'm saying no to the tightrope.
Okay.
I think that there is more upside than downside to being clear about your accomplishments. And I don't think you do it, like the biggest jerk in the office does it, but I think you do it clearly, consistently, and with confidence. So to give an example, in the how-to world of the example you just gave, is being able to say, here's what I've been able to accomplish here. And if she would have been doing those boss emails, that probably wouldn't have been an issue. If she would have asked for time in front of the board to update them, make sure she's the one doing those presentations so it's clear. And obviously it takes a village to do that, to get a merger done, but she's the leader of that team. And so being able to be clear about, here's what we set out to do, here's what we accomplished. And it took, the 30 members of the team to make that a reality. But being clear, it was your project.
Yeah.
And what you brought to the table to get it done.
That is great. That is great. So, where could somebody start besides the boss email? If you want to show up more courageously, be more visible, and sort of make sure that people are noticing.
Yeah, I think there's 3 things you can do right out of the gate that are super simple. One is get clear about your strengths and practice articulating them and how they relate to the business. So instead of saying, I'm great at running projects, you work on a statement that says, I'm incredibly good at. And it's 1 sentence, and here's what it does for the business. So going back to that, just to use the example, that communication we talked about earlier, I'm good at communicating. That tells me nothing. If I'm your boss, I don't know what to do with you with that. But if instead you say, I'm incredibly good at taking disparate opinions, a team with disparate opinions and ideas, creating a common vision and moving them more quickly toward an end result, regardless of the noise around them. Now I know what to do with you. Now I know where to put you, where you can be of most value. So get a group of friends together and talk about that and get used to having that roll off your tongue. So that's the first thing, know your strengths. Second thing is show up. When you show up to a meeting, share your opinion, prepare. One of the tools that we use or suggest in our programs is for 2 minutes before every meeting you go into, think about what's a win for you in that meeting. What makes that time well spent for you? And by getting your brain focused on that, you actually show up differently to the meeting to be able to try and get that result It's to share my opinion about this, or to get a decision on that, or to whatever it is. Third thing about visibility is stop, dear Lord, asking for permission. Do not raise your hand. Do not, have you ever seen a guy raise their hand in a meeting to be acknowledged? Absolutely not. Lead with the punchline. Don't apologize. Don't put a whole bunch of fluff and words around it. Don't go, oh, I'm sorry. Oh no, I did. Because men, apparently we have 2 seconds to be able to get a guy's attention and to keep it. So you have to lead with the punchline. I disagree with that. Here's why. I think the best next step is, so get comfortable with clarity, which will help you become more visible.
I love that. Get comfortable with clarity. That's a good one. Yeah. Oh boy, I think that's going to be one of our tweetable tweets here.
I like it.
So I'm on my 3rd page of notes here. So, so Cindy, let me just circle back to something you mentioned in passing earlier. Executive presence. That's a big piece of what I help people with. But when somebody hears you don't have executive presence, and it probably means they don't know what to do with you, so it's like a catch-all phrase. Can you expand on that, please?
I think this amorphous executive presence idea has become the easy go-to. I don't want to promote you, and so I'm going to say this phrase that apparently everybody now uses, and it's going to keep you from getting promoted.
Yeah.
And we've all heard it. I heard it in my career. I think we've all heard it. Men very rarely hear it, by the way. But women hear it all the time. And so what we've done is we've taken executive presence and we've defined the skills that it takes to be great at the things that we know is the end result, which is,
wait, are you talking about
being visible.
you, your company, or we,
yes.
society?
So no,
so your company. So your company.
So we've defined it as courageous presence, and we've broken it into 4 specific skill areas. Relationship presence, which is building your sphere of influence, which you teach this to your clients all the time, which is hugely important. Communication presence, which is how you show up, what you look like, leading with the punchline, etc. Core presence, which is about understanding who you are and where you want to get to. So being clear about, in 3 years, I want to be at this next level, or next year, I need a bigger span of control.
Yeah.
Or I want an international assignment. So it's having that core vision. And then the 4th is that strength presence, which is you got to figure out what you're great at and go after roles that allow you to use that. Because by the time we get to mid-career, we know what we're good at and what we're not. And we know where our passion lies. And so, but being able to, it's stunning to me how many women in particular haven't taken the time to be able to do that strength statement.
Well, and to define it.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's funny because, again, in the workshops, one of the examples we give is, if I'm a CEO and I just hired all of you, I have to know with detail where I can put you to get the biggest bang for my dollar. And until you can describe that to me, you're invisible to me. Until I know where I can use you in the best possible way, but until I know where I can use your talents, you're just baggage over here for me. And I think that's what gets in our way more times than not.
I love that. Oh, that's fabulous. Oh, there's so much gold here, Cindy. Thank you so much. I could keep you talking for hours, but I know we both have hard stops. So we'll certainly be posting how people can find out more about you and so forth. Is there one thing we could start with? What's one thing to leave us with?
Well, one of the quotes that I use at the end of all my keynotes that I think is really true is that everything you want is just outside your comfort zone. And having the courage to realize that getting what you want is going to be scary, and it's going to take effort, and it's going to take you taking action in spite of the fear. But doing that every day will build that courage muscle. Just do one thing a day, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, right? Just do one thing a day that pushes you a little bit, because the more you exercise that muscle, the stronger it will become.
I love it. Cindy Solomon, thank you so much for being a guest on Speakers Who Get Results. You're just one of my favorite people, and I'm just so happy to have you here.
Right back at you, my friend.
So thank you, everybody, for listening. And let me remind you that if you're curious about your presentation skills and your executive presence, if you will, and how you're doing, you can take our free quiz at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And in 4 minutes, you can see where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could get you some results. This has been Elizabeth Bachman. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.